talked about this a bit in my award-winning video, Canada Has Failed, but for a number of reasons, in recent years, the Canadian government has become much more enthusiastic about the idea of maximizing the autonomy of Canadian Indian bands, adopting what Prime Minister Trudeau has often called a nation-to-nation relationship. His government likewise recently passed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is basically the most explicit acknowledgement in Canadian law to date that Aboriginal Canadians are a people with rights and powers that exist completely independently of the Canadian state. Canada has had Indian treaties and Indian reserves for a long time, but under the changing mindset of Ottawa and this new UN DRIP framework, there has become much more interest in basically revisiting all of the attitudes and institutions that have defined Canadian Indigenous relations up until now. This is sometimes described as the agenda of decolonization and reconciliation, but it can be pretty ambiguous what the end goal of it all is. Obviously, the original sin of Canada was Europeans stealing land from the natives, but so much has happened in the centuries since that this isn't really a cake that can be unbaked. Despite the slogans of some activists, the land is obviously never going to be given back in total. But that said, you could imagine a future scenario in which the various Indigenous nations are permitted to exert more control over Canada in a sort of landlord type way, exercising more oversight and veto power over what is done on their traditional lands, which of course is basically the entire country. The Canadian judicial system has gradually been establishing an Indigenous power of consultation and veto as constitutional rights in the Canadian system, and I would assume that if we extrapolate several decades or so into the future, you could imagine Indigenous rights to have grown so expansive that the First Nations are basically co-governing the country in some way. Prime Minister Trudeau's administration has recently begun efforts to create something known as a Reconciliation Council, which is basically a body of Indigenous Canadian leaders to supervise the federal government's decolonization agenda. I think you could envision something like this eventually morphing into some sort of co-governing body that could conceivably even supersede the powers of the Ottawa government in various important ways. Now, could Canada survive this form of Indigenous nationalism? I think there are certainly people on the far left who would like to see the Canadian settler state completely broken down and replaced with some sort of post-colonial Indigenous-led society. But more realistically, I think you could also imagine some sort of post-apartheid South Africa type situation where the state survives but with a completely different sense of purpose and identity at its core. Some might even call it Canada's original sin. Now, the history of Indigenous peoples on this half of North America and their interactions with the Europeans is a very long story that mostly predates the existence of any Canadian state. But when Will Ferguson refers to this idea of getting the natives to somehow disappear, he is describing the dominant attitude in Canadian Indian policy from the time of the country's modern founding in 1867 to, I don't know, sometime in the last 30 years or so, possibly even this year, for reasons we will get to in a bit. So one important difference between Canada and the United States was that the majority of Canadian land was colonized much later than the lands of the US. The year 1890 was both the year that the American government famously declared the American frontier closed, as well as the year of the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is usually considered the last of America's so-called Indian Wars. In contrast, the great era of colonization of the Canadian West only really kicked off with the election of Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier in 1896. This was actually something that the Laurier administration made a big deal about in their propaganda campaigns to get white settlers to the vast Canadian prairies. This idea that Canada was the world's last great frontier for white farmers looking to make a new life in the New World. The fact that they had to resort to propaganda campaigns, in turn, reflected the fact that much of Canada, as you might have heard, is a bit of an unpleasant snowy wasteland as opposed to the much more inviting lands of the American West and South, which white pioneers didn't need any particular encouragement to stampede into. When American settlers flooded into these areas in the late 18th and early 19th century, the result was often horrific wars against the indigenous population, in which the US Army sought to play defense for whites who were just assumed to always be in the right, and the supposedly violent, savage Indians to always be in the wrong. There were times in which this violence against natives reached truly epic and even genocidal proportions, and as time went on, it did provoke some shame and outrage in parts of white North American society. Canada's great era of colonization in the late 19th century was informed by this, and was thus carried out in a manner that was no less imperial and racist, but also more smug and self-righteous, as Canadians are wont to be. Like the Americans, the Canadians sought to obtain Indian land through treaties of surrender, but the Canadian process was more cowardly and cynical. Government agents would persuade small groups of natives, rather than large indigenous nations, to sign treaties surrendering small areas of their land to settlers in exchange for promises that were often only made orally. And then once the settlers moved in, the borders of the surrendered territory would be arbitrarily expanded, and the oral promises would go ignored because, hey, there was no record of them being made. The fact that there was no armed Aboriginal resistance to any of this, except in Manitoba, is often seen as a byproduct of the intimidation that many Indigenous peoples of this continent would have felt by that time, given what they had seen happen in the United States over the last century. The other important thing is that the late 19th century also represented a high watermark for a certain sort of Victorian paternalism and Darwinist racism. There was a lot of back-patting among the Canadian elite in those days that just as they had taken the land from the Indians in a more civilized way than the Americans, so too would they prove themselves better at assimilating them into white Christian society. There was actually a thinking at the time that Americans were too morbidly fascinated by savage Indian culture, and there would be none of that in Canada. Heavy-handed efforts to assimilate Aboriginal people out of their supposedly backwards cultures until they were no longer interested in being a distinct people was of course something that was practiced on both sides of the border. Ultra-assimilationist Indian residential boarding schools existed in both countries in an effort to kill the Indian in the child, as the infamous saying went, as did programs to incentivize Native people to leave their remaining treaty lands, and with them the special protections of the government. The following 1931 quote from a man called Duncan Campbell Scott, who was a bigwig in Canadian Indian policy during the 20th century, probably summarizes the dominant attitude well.
The government will in time reach the end of its responsibility as the Indians progress into civilization and fully disappear as a separate and distinct people, not by race extinction, but by gradual assimilation.
But Canada stuck with this approach a fair bit longer than America.
You might know Harbor Freight for affordability. What you might not know is performance and durability.
And this is one reason why Indigenous relations in Canada often seem more tense and even toxic than in the US. Richard Nixon's administration in the early 1970s is often seen as the point in which the American government adopted an unambiguous policy of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty over Indigenous lands as a permanent fact of the American system. Nixon also formally abandoned what was known as the policy of termination, which was the idea that the whole treaty rights-based system for American Indians should be gradually eliminated. At almost the exact same time, however, Canada's government, under Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was doubling down on this idea that the separate status for Canadian Indians was something that the government both could and should eliminate. It was not until 1985, in fact, that termination, or enfranchisement, as it was more euphemistically known in this country, was formally extinguished as an objective of Canadian Indian policy. Now, a lot of people would say that Pierre Elliott Trudeau had perfectly defensible modern motives for pursuing this policy as long as he did. I actually made a whole video in which I discussed his philosophy about this issue, which I do think is defensible from an individual rights perspective. But these days, there is also a fairly broad consensus that Canada's leaders remained aloof and imperious about Indigenous policy for far too long, and that this perpetuated a legacy of distrustful, dysfunctional relationships. In any case, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau, is now in charge, and the other day his government passed what is perhaps the most sweeping affirmation of inherent Indigenous rights ever, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or remained aloof and imperious about individual rights perspective. But these days, there is also a fairly broad consensus that Canada's leaders remained aloof and imperious about Indigenous policy for far too long, and that this perpetuated a legacy of distrustful, dysfunctional relationships. In any case, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau, is now in charge, and the other day, his government passed what is perhaps the most sweeping affirmation of inherent Indigenous rights ever, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. According to the enabling legislation, it is now the goal of the Canadian government to take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with UNDRIP. And what does UNDRIP say? Well, it declares that Indigenous people possess an inherent right to self-determination and a right to autonomy or self-government. It also says that the Canadian government must obtain the free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect Indigenous peoples, including, specifically, their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources. This legislation has been heralded by many Indigenous rights activists as an important step in Canada affirming Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous land rights as a permanent fact of the Canadian system.
Basically, all the laws and policies that deny existing Aboriginal and treaty rights will have to be changed to get in line with recognition of Aboriginal rights and title and jurisdiction. That's going to be a huge piece. Because we've got, for example, 4 pieces of legislation: the Comprehensive Claims Policy, Specific Claims Policy, Additions to Reserve Policy, and the Inherent Right to Self-Government Policy are all currently based on termination of rights, title, and jurisdiction.
It is certainly a very dramatic rejection of much of Canadian history and early conceptions of what was once called the Indian problem. But it would also be naive to suggest that staging such a dramatic reversal of national goals would not be without challenges either. The Conservative Party voted against the UNDRIP bill, in part because they said that this whole idea of free and informed consent could be interpreted by the courts as giving Indigenous governments an open-ended veto over any Canadian initiative they dislike, especially natural resource projects critical to the national economy.
When a First Nation says no to a project, does that mean it's dead? It leaves a lot of unanswered questions and potentially the courts to decide that definition.
And it's a fair concern given that the Canadian courts have generally been at the forefront of expanding Indigenous rights, often in dramatic or disruptive ways. Canada's Indigenous population is not huge, only about 5 or 6%, a number that of course reflects centuries of determined efforts to make them somehow disappear. The fact that this minority may now wield disproportionate power is the ironic legacy of admitting the injustice of this failed goal.